Hello everybody, welcome to our online debate on the EU climate action. Today we will be talking about three priorities for EU climate action in the coming 5 years. So three priorities, 5 years, two speakers, one moderator, numbers matter. And I'm here with our guest speakers, the Baroness Bryony Worthington, and with Delbeke. So let me just very briefly introduce our speakers. First, Bryony is Executive Director of Environmental Defence Fund Europe, and she has been appointed as Life Peer to the House of Lords in 2011, is that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. She served as Shadow Minister for Energy and Climate Change in the House of Lords, and was advisor for sustainable energy policy for Scottish and Southern Energy. And on top of that, it's a long list, I'm just squeezing things. Bryony founded the Sandbag Climate Campaign, a group that is very active in scrutinizing the EU emission trading scheme, and I often read the report. Mm-hmm. And before that, she was lead author of the United Kingdom Climate Change Act. Delbeke is senior advisor now at the European Political Strategy Center of the European Commission, and also part-time professor at UI in Florence at the School of Transitional Governance, where we collaborate often on what we call the climate cluster, and is also part-time professor at KU Leuven in Belgium, right? Former Director General of the European Commission, Director General for Climate Action. I think that's how everybody used to know him, and has been responsible for international climate change strategy and the chief negotiator at the UN climate conferences. I consider him, but I'm not the only one to consider him, as the father of the European emission trading system, mm-hmm. although he was the father of other things before. And in 2015, he co-authored the book EU Climate Policy Explained. So, two very expert speakers to discuss about what to do next. We are at a very particular moment with European elections coming in a few weeks, with lots going on at the world level, and I'm thinking of a globalized world that has less globalization now. I'm thinking of Brexit. I'm thinking of European difficulties, but also European action in the climate field that is very strong. So, in this context, mm-hmm. my simple, not so simple question is, Bryony, what are your three top priorities for the next 5 years?
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this debate. I'm delighted to speak with you and with you today. So my three priorities for the incoming presidency and commission are that we really need to set a long-term target for emissions in Europe, and that needs to be zero emissions by 2050 at a minimum. And the reason I say that is because we are the bloc that has most responsibility, and we can take most credit for the Paris Agreement being agreed, which is a huge success, and European efforts made that possible, alongside some very fortunate politics. And we've got to make that a success, and that means coming forward with ambitious targets for those countries that can afford to do so. And I really think net zero for Europe is a target we should be looking to legislate for. So that's one big challenge.
Step one.
Step two, more immediately in the 5 years, we cannot see any rolling back of the Youthing package. It was hard fought for, and it struck a balance. If anything, what I'd like to see is it becoming more ambitious in the 2030 timeframe. And I think the way we can do that is if we focus in on transport and we look at it through the lens of air quality. Because it's clear when you look at the benefits of taking oil out of transport in cities, you get a huge payback in economic terms right now if you can do that. So I think let's work further on it. We've got some great standards on vehicles, but then still the net effect is that on aggregate they're still producing too much CO2. And then the third one is, again, looking out globally again. I would love Europe to engage, it already is engaged, but to do more on those global sectors that sit outside Paris, and there I'm thinking aviation and shipping. And that global sectoral approach may help us to think about sectoral linkages in, say, other contentious sectors like steel. It's just a question whether we can do this. But certainly with shipping and aviation, the frameworks are already there. EU engagement would make a huge difference, and being ambitious there is going to help us establish, I think, global rules that will really bring forward technologies and bring costs down. So,
zero emissions, transports, and central linkages.
Yes. Can I just say on the zero emissions, I should have said this, it's all GHG, and there must be a focus on methane and short-lived pollutants. It's something that we feel very passionately about, that as long as the oil and gas is in the sector, we've got to ensure that methane is tackled. It's very cost-effective, but also methane ultimately from agriculture is going to be a big thing too.
Yeah.
So sorry, that came in under my first point.
Yeah,
if I'm allowed.
You're allowed. You're allowed. It's an important point. Jos, do you agree?
To a large extent, yes. Yes, I think my points are very much coinciding. But I would, as my first point, stress a lot the implementation of what has been agreed for 2030. I think not everybody realizes, as of now, how important the decisions have been and how many pressures there are going to be on local policies or national policies to deliver the emission reductions. So implementation is very important. Now we see it in the ETS. Prices are 25, 27 euros, but we are also going to see in the entire cluster of climate and energy policy that we are going to have a lot more to do on the renewables, on energy efficiency, on the governance, also in the cluster of transport. A number of very important decisions have been made on the decarbonization and the standards for cars and lorries. So good implementation, I would not say good, but excellent implementation, and no wavering, no hesitation when one or the other pressure comes up, and pressures are going to come up. So full implementation of the package as it is now for 2030. The second point is, and again I would like to agree with Bryony, is on transport. You know, on transport, it's going mad and wrong everywhere. We are neutralizing the successes done on the stationary sources, and in particular on aviation and international aviation, and on maritime transport, the international sectors. It's not going well, and we see the rates of increase are hundreds of percentages. So we are talking emission reductions in other sectors, but these sectors keep increasing without any end. So we will have to have a fresh look at what ICAO is deciding on the course here. It's not looking good, let's be frank with one another. It's a useful first step, but it is a very, very weak first step. We will have a lot more to do. Also in IMO, we have now a target, but let's face it, you know, the target is not yet leading to actions. So transport is absolutely a priority. Road transport, what we see in the cities and on our highways, but also aviation and maritime. And my third priority would be our cooperation with the world. Development cooperation, we are the biggest donor in the world. More than 50% of international aid is given by the EU countries. Let's not forget about that. And we have to gear that up to underline and support our climate targets. And in particular, the implementation of the commitments that the countries took in Paris. Because nice plans were brought on the table, but they are not being implemented, except for a few countries. I think Europe is doing well, China is doing well, a limited number of other countries are doing well, but it is a limited number of countries. And so helping each other on how to implement policies so as to deliver at least what we said in Paris we would do is a very important step for the next 5 years. Because if we do all three well, then decarbonization by the middle of the century becomes possible. But if we fail in the next 5 years on implementing what we agreed in controlling transport emissions and then gearing up our development cooperation, we are not going to get there. So I think I would have that as my strong trio, put forward.
Mm-hmm. In a way, there seem to be three necessary conditions for the first top priority we are talking about. And it's interesting that there is an overlapping, because you both mentioned transport. We have the feeling that transport is really a key problem to address soon. And so, just to summarize, implementation, transports, and cooperation with the world are your priorities. And probably with a ranking, if I may add, because you mentioned implementation several times, in the sense that it's time to do things. And I think also the movement out there, future Fridays for Future, really urges us to act. Thank you. I want to take a look to the top priorities that emerge from the audience. Let's see if the audience has the same view on the priorities. And I actually have a list of things that came up in these days. I at least not in a ranking, but I noticed that the audience referred to renewables, decentralization, decarbonization, competitiveness, governance, sector coupling, cost effectiveness and affordability, sustainable development, carbon pricing, education. You can see also in size terms the words that come more often. So they seem to be very much in line with what you're saying, and they seem to be the keywords that drive the feelings of our audience. But on top of that, I can see that our audience is writing questions, and so I don't want to use their own time, and I was to take the opportunity to pick up the questions as they come, if you agree. So, starting from Thomas Brewer, Thomas is writing, there is an increasing interest and support, for instance, from the French government in a Mediterranean maritime emission control area. Do you support this? I will start with you.
Well, I think yes. And I suspect that relates more to air quality than it does climate change emissions. So our focus on climate for shipping is through the IMO. We want strong European representation there and strong EU incentives. But the way to really tackle shipping is to do it through the IMO. So from a climate perspective.
Okay.
Yeah, I can pick up the second question on the role of hydrogen. And I would take it in a broad perspective. We need innovations. We need low carbon innovations, and hydrogen is certainly going to be part of the equation. And so I would say, yes, we support the role of hydrogen, in particular for main industrial users. There is a lot of interest in hydrogen in the cars and whatever, but let's do it there first, where it is the most practical. And I think what we see happening in major industrial emitters in the steel sector, cement, chemicals, etc., there is a major potential for hydrogen there.
Yes, I would say we're particularly interested in power to X, meaning excess renewable power being converted into fuels for long-distance transport. So by that, really, we're focusing on shipping at the moment, but it could apply in other long-distance transport where you need a fuel. And we're actually interested in ammonia as a hydrogen carrier. It's a very effective way of storing hydrogen. Now, these are not cheap at the moment. You're going to take your renewables, convert it into electricity, then convert it into ammonia. It's all doable. The engineering is all fine, and the ships can actually burn it right now with a minimal modification. And we see this speaks to Jos's third point. If we can do this in places where there's an abundance of renewables, in, say, sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, that could be a really great way of unlocking investment into countries which otherwise wouldn't invest in that scale because they don't have much energy demand. But if they've got ships and ports, this could be a great way of unlocking investment. So I think hydrogen will have a big role to play where we need fuels, but it might be that it's hydrogen/ammonia that we should be looking at.
Right. There is one question that we cannot avoid, we cannot ignore, and I'm actually very happy to pose it. Greta Thunberg says we need to cut pollution at least twice as fast. Is she right? And I want the opinion of both of you on this.
Probably yes, but we have to implement. We have to make the emissions going down. And I would put the emphasis not so much on new targets, but on much better implementation, because that's the way to get there. And I think we should put the focus where the focus must be, and it is on implementation that we are not doing sufficiently well. And I think that is what the youngsters in the streets are saying us. Implement better, start the job, do it now. And we can have lots of ideas about 2050 and 2080 and all the technologies, but we have to start now and be very ambitious now. And I think that is what I take out of the question.
Yes. I mean, I completely agree that long distance targets are important, 2030, 2050. They send a very strong signal, especially when they're legislated. But what we really know from the science is that we need to be doing as much as we can, as fast as we can. So that near-term implementation is hugely important. And what we do in 2020 is really important. So, and there are plenty of low-hanging fruit that we could be doing more, and getting more renewables, since they seem to be able to be deployed fast, and now the costs are coming down, particularly in southern Europe states. We were talking about Portugal and the progress that Portugal's made. Can we export the Portuguese and Spanish models out to Italy, out to Greece? The southern Mediterranean countries have been slow to catch up on the solar. Europe can make this happen. So implementation in the near term is absolutely critical. She's right, we can do more and we can do it faster.
And that links into the next question about Portugal
and
which kind of technologies we think should be in place by 2050. I think a raft of new technologies, but we already mentioned hydrogen. I think also carbon capture and storage and use is going to be part of them. But I would like to put particular emphasis on how we produce industrial commodities. Because steel production, cement production, lots of chemicals are very emission intensive. And so we have to cut down emissions there with a factor 50, 70, 80%. Otherwise, we will never come close to the climate neutrality or the carbon neutrality by the middle of the century. So we need low carbon steel. We need low carbon chemicals, low carbon cement. And it's good to see that a lot of companies are already investing heavily in this orientation, and with the help of hydrogen and carbon capture and storage and a raft of new technologies, the digital sector has a major contribution to make. There are lots of things we have to invest in, but we have to start investing now and not say we are going to do it in 5 years or 10 years, because that is putting off too long. We have to do it now.
And we've got the perfect architecture, because the ETS gives us revenues that we can use to invest into some of these technologies. I would perhaps link that, focus on industrial, which is completely correct, into the gas network question, which follows. It's clear that if we're going to keep gas in the system for industrial uses and even for some domestic uses, then we may be needing to transition it into more of a hydrogen network. There are technical challenges, but we're going to have to do carbon capture and storage incredibly well. And I'm quite excited by the Net Power project in the US. It's a new form of gas-based CCS, and it claims that it doesn't have any energy penalty, and it produces pure stream CO2 very easily for capture. So, there will be breakthroughs, I think, in CCS on gas that we need to see tested out, deployed at scale, to see if they work. And then once we have that, that should become our best available technology. And then we can start to decarbonize gas. It's not my top priority. Coal, oil, those are the things we need to get out of the system fastest. Lignite actually should be number one. But gas will need to be decarbonized if we're going to use it. So we need to be looking at these potential breakthroughs on the CCS.
Even because the shift towards gas is relevant. I mean, it's already going on, so we have to make it even faster. What's next? How shall we deal with countries that do not play along? US, Russia, India, China, to a certain extent. Will you still recommend these policies if the competitiveness of our industry is suffering? A very direct, sharp question.
Yes.
Who first?
Well, you've had lots.
We have to continue putting a lot of pressure on them, and I think what we are doing with Mr. Trump, is paying off to some extent. When I see that in the Congress, there are steps taken not to leave the Paris Agreement, which is a tiny first step, but still it's important, and it is important to put pressure on the rest of the world to implement what they promised in Paris, and therefore we have to use the name and shame. In Katowice, we were, adopting quite a number of transparency rules, and we have to exploit that to the full. then we have to use what instruments we have. We have trade agreements with the whole world. We are putting now in the trade agreements respect for the Paris Agreement. And perhaps we have to make it a bit more active. It's not being in the Paris Agreement, but also what you do under the Paris Agreement. Implementation. I think we could use our bilateral instruments for that. And then I know there is behind the question always the border measures, that are popping up. I think we have to study them, but we have to avoid that we fall into the trap of President Trump, and that is being very unilateral in our measures. So let's continue to have a multilateral approach to things. Perhaps we have to open up a debate in the WTO and to put all parties around the table and to have objective criteria, but not ad hoceries, because ad hoceries may undermine our future possibilities for trade development. So I think we have to be astute. There is a new agenda coming. This trade issue in particular, let's not dream, low carbon steel, low carbon cement is going to be more expensive than the normal steel and cement we are having. So let's prepare that future, but do it orderly, do it not emotionally, and let's talk to the rest of the world. And for that, we have the Paris Agreement.
I couldn't agree more. I think there are two extra elements, if I may. One is one of the reasons we're interested in these global sectoral frameworks in shipping and aviation is that they're a hangover from the good old days of pooled sovereignty. When we recognised you needed to have global rules in order for a sector to flourish. Given the course that you're about to launch is about climate governance, can we conceive of a new era of pooled sovereignty for sectoral agreements on climate change? It's not going to be easy. Everyone's moving in the opposite direction, but the pendulum may swing. And then I would say steel was probably the first candidate. It's a highly concentrated sector, very exposed to trade. We could probably get all the major players into one room. How could we conceive of something that would level out the playing field for these very hard to abate sectors, they're hard to abate politically. Physically, I think we could probably do it, but it's how do you get that level playing field? And then the second element, which may be a bit controversial, is we will have technologies now being developed that will help keep an enforcement mechanism at a global level. I'm thinking about satellites and tall tower networks, which are able to pinpoint when emissions are not being reported correctly or whether there's an obvious potential problem. So we're investing as an NGO in a satellite that can look at methane globally. There are plenty of other satellites being launched, being conceived. We have other technology we can use, like tall towers. We might just need to get a little bit more hard around the enforcement and tracking of this problem.
Yeah. On the competitiveness, I think very good work is taking place. I think everybody recognizes the problem. The World Bank, with the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, is having a working group on that. And I think good work is being done just to rationalize the debate in order to prevent we are falling into the trap of protectionism or of all too unilateral measures that may backfire in the end, because we look at the world as major importers, but the other parts of the world are looking at major exporters, in particular to us. So there is a very refined balance to be found there, that we have to do that in an orderly manner. And it's coming on the table, but let's take a rational view at it.
Well, it's interesting. Someone just asked about methane, and we're one of the world's biggest consumers of gas, and they're coming from countries we might want to see to toughen up some of their standards. So, as the biggest consuming market, we should have some leverage.
Just what about remediation policies?
I think with remediation policies, I think it's adaptation policies that is being addressed. Is it
drawdown?
I'm a bit confused about the remediation, what is meant by that. But on adaptation, let's put it that way. I mean, we know the costs that are coming on us, costs that are being taken on by local authorities, regional authorities, and these are going to play a much bigger role in the future, because a lot of implementation is taking place on the ground. And on the ground meets locally, and that is where we have to activate that area, which is very different from mitigation. Let's face up to reality. Adaptation is coming closer to local realities, because the manifestation of climate change is different according to the places and the endowment of a particular locality. But certainly something we have to reinforce our attention on.
I think that's right. Speaking politically, the adaptation part of it, it worries me greatly, but it does sort of have much more of an immediate political impact. So you find politicians standing knee high in water saying, no price is too high, we will organise ourselves, so this will be sorted. So adaptation tends to actually demand more political attention in the short term. So it's not that I say it's not important, but mitigation is always the hardest, and that's why I tend to focus on that. But I think maybe remediation also includes this concept of repair, in the sense that we're overshooting. Our emissions concentrations are far too high already, and what are we going to do about that? And I read this morning on Twitter that it's like saying, how do you if you can't collect the smoke after a fire, it's very hard. It's best not to light the fire in the first place. That's still always true, but the fire has been burning for 100 years, and we may well need to do something to draw down. So that will be expensive, but we probably can't rule it out.
Your image is very powerful, because I was going to ask, how would you reply to someone who says, okay, adaptation is, you're basically giving up? No, we're not giving up. We are turning off the fire, or trying to water it down. Let's quell the fire first. This is our first priority.
Also, let's be real. We are now facing a climate change, and the consequences of that of 1 degree Celsius. We said in Paris we would do well below 2 degrees, but that's much warmer compared to what we have today. And people are already complaining about shortages of water. And we know the sea level is rising, and we know the glaciers are disappearing. So it's not going to stop. We are going to be able to slow down. So adaptation to climate change is a natural thing that we will have to include in our normal public policies.
Yeah, we will. And the impact on the insurance industry and the financial industry is starting to be appreciated. The wildfires in California had a dramatic effect, because they forced a company to become, bankrupted it because of the liabilities. This is a huge change, and that's and these continental land masses like the US are going to be hit time and time again by impacts. So that will have a change in the global politics. And then you have the awful tragedy of Africa and India now having typhoons and cyclones hitting them. It's not going to. This will be on the political agenda for the rest of our time, I think.
What is striking me, listening to the debates and looking at the slide where, what comes from the suggestions made by the audience, is that transport is not targeted as a major issue. It's about energy. And of course, what we have to do in Europe, we have to continue the decarbonization of the power sector. I mean, without that, we will never get close to a carbon neutral Europe. So that needs to happen. But part of that will have to be done in transport. And that is where we are doing very bad. So let's not over-concentrate ourselves on electricity, because fuel use is the other big part. And of course, we will have a switch through the electric vehicles and things like that. But still, fuel use is going to be very important. So I think that transport is still meriting a lot more attention compared to where we are today. Aviation, maritime, we said that before, but also on the road transport, and we have to review a number of things, because the externalities are not paid for by the transport sector. Let's face up to that reality. There is a major problem there.
I agree, and I'd be very interested in your views, just because there are two things that seem to me that the next Commission could do. One is unite the air quality debate with the climate debate, so we get some really serious standards for urban air quality that will mean that we are really getting oil out of our cities. But then there's the question in Germany now, and in the UK it's going to come up quickly. Should we be extending carbon pricing across the transport sector? I mean, I've always thought that would make a good sector to include in a market or a carbon pricing mechanism, because it's not as exposed to competition as other sectors. You will get some leakage in Luxembourg. Everyone will fill up in Luxembourg. It happens already. But at the EU level, we could probably think now seriously about extending. What do you think that's viable?
Well, some member states are bringing that on the table. There have been with member states like the Nordics, and Austria are toying with the idea about how to bring it into the ETS. Has not been done before, and there is not yet a concrete proposal on the table. But we should not say no to that. But on a number of provisions. And one of the essential provisions is that we cannot touch or review downward the excess duties that are already on fuels. So it should be an addition, levy or charge or whatever, or an allowance price, and we could organize that. But today that has not yet been part of the discussion. And I think that one of the things we are trying to develop in our discussions in Florence is what is the ideal coverage of emissions trading. We are used now in the ETS. We have a power sector and a manufacturing industry. The Chinese start with the power sector, but go much beyond that. They are also going to cover domestic aviation, for example, and also buildings and energy use. The Californians are, covering those. So the coverage of sectors and emission activities under the ETS could be up for review.
And I think this is really crucial, and would be great to have some work advanced on this for the next commission coming in, because California has put transport in already and shown that it's possible, but they've complemented it with other policies that have helped defray some of the social impacts of putting more price on transport fuels, because essentially you're right, it's got to be additional. And I think this is really fascinating, because the Gilets jaunes, we can't talk about this without acknowledging that we've had some, Greta has mobilised positively, but there's been also negative mobilisation. So when we do transport, we've got to do it in a socially progressive way, but we could use the revenues of an additional measure to bring in policies that help lower demographic families to adapt to a carbon-free transport future. And the technologies are coming now where they should be able to enjoy access to electric vehicles, which are cheaper to run. They are actually cheaper to run in many, many situations, but there's just the capital cost that needs to be overcome. So it would be exciting to have an EU program thinking about a socially progressive transport strategy that complements the standards on vehicles and doesn't roll back, but adds extra social dimensions.
Yeah, but we will already see the development of road pricing systems.
Yeah.
We have the Euro vignette for lorries. It's there. For passenger cars, it may be there as well in areas. The big cities are all stuck with too much traffic. So they will have to manage that. And the ETS may not be capable of doing that. It may have other incentives, but locally the traffic management question remains squarely on the table. So perhaps we can load up road pricing with variation of tariffs according to the vehicle or the fuel you are using, etc. So there are possibilities to have market-based incentives in instruments that other sectors may come up with. Like the transport sector has a huge problem. I mean, you leave your home, but in peak hour, you never know when you are going to arrive on time. So the fluidity of transport systems is an issue. I would hope for professionals in the transport sector. And then we have to load up that climate change variable and the emissions factor. And that may be another or a complementary way of doing things, but it's a new area.
Yeah, definitely. But it'd be great for an incoming DG Move or whoever to really prioritize.
Yeah, I agree, because it's something that is really, has a direct impact on the perception that people have of the air quality, of life quality.
Yeah.
So,
and it would make up for this horrible period we've just been through, where we did climate and air quality separately, and we had the Dieselgate as a result. And I feel angry about that, and I'm sure, people who've got kids with asthma feel very angry about this. So Europe's got to show that it's learned that lesson and go forward in a unified way, I think.
And I also am angry about that. I'm a former official, right? I mean, we were part of the genesis of this legislation, and then you see that companies are paying professionals to circumvent what has been agreed in a democratic way. So that is really a very serious wake-up call for anything we are doing. Because if officials and the public system and the political system brings forward legislation, and then the private sector is paying people to circumvent the implementation of that legislation, that is really a serious matter that we can.
Acting as a cartel in doing so. I mean,
Yeah.
you broke all the rules. This is why transport. I hope if we did another poll, I would hope we could get transport further up, because it does feel like
both of you.
Yes.
Okay. Well, there was also a question about the World Bank and the IMF and the international institutions could do. I think that the World Bank has a very important role. They give support financial support to so many countries in the world. So they could use, for example, the benchmarks that are being developed by us, by the Chinese, by others. You know, you shall not make new investments below a certain standard in a sector like power or steel or whatever. So that could be a way of looking at things.
Precondition,
Yeah.
and on the other hand, also help.
Yeah.
To,
and where the World Bank also
exactly.
can contribute is in offsets. So the Article 6 negotiations of the Paris Agreement, we need to have a fresh look at how we organize offsets. We have the cold shower of the CDM. We should draw a line and start all anew because it's a useful instrument, but it has to be better framed and better governed. And the governance went terribly wrong.
And the enforcement now is enabled through remote sensing and satellites in far easier ways than we had before. No, but I would say, why stop? Really, this is a very Western perspective. The Asian Development Bank and the Chinese Belt and Road initiatives, they're going to really be the financial powerhouses that we need to ensure have got green and climate credentials right bedded into them. Just to make sure we don't forget that that's an issue.
To be honest, there are so many questions that we'll have to pick up a few ones.
Okay. Should we go to the end and work backwards, or it could to catch up?
Oh, it's hard to catch up.
It is hard to catch up.
I'll take this one if you don't mind.
No, don't do that one. Those are the transport ones, so we've got...
No, exactly. We can skip this one. I think there was another one.
There was one about UK. Do you understand? Because the UK and Brexit hasn't come up. Or at least it probably has come up.
Yes, that's a question I would suggest.
Bryony, question in the meantime, and you start talking.
I saw it. I saw the B word there. I'm sure
But what's your opinion about Brexit?
Well, let's turn to Bryony.
Okay. Well, listen. Here's my take. We never really fully joined Europe, and we'll never really fully leave. So there will be an arrangement going forward. That is clear. If you take all the froth of the politics out, we can't geographically take ourselves away from our largest trading partner, nor should we want to. So we will stay aligned, I'm sure. On the climate side, there's lots of other questions we shouldn't really get into here, and freedom of movement, etc. But on the climate side, I think we'll stay in lockstep because we're pushing ahead. We're not leaving the EU because of a fear of climate change regulations, and far the opposite, actually. I would hope that if we did leave, we will keep moving forward and we'll keep in close parity. And our voice in Europe, I hope, won't be lost. So we have to make that the case.
I found the question in the meantime. What role could UK play outside EU?
Yeah. There we go. We are. So we've got. That was my answer.
But I would also hope that under the ETS, the ETS is now formally linked up with the Swiss ETS. So if the UK wants to leave the ETS and a Brexit without an agreement would lead to that, then I would hope that the UK ETS can link up to the EU ETS, because we know that there is a hard law in politics. The more players you have in a market, the lower the costs are for all the players around. So the cost-effective implementation increases massively with the number of players you have. So there is a rationale for the EU as well as for the UK to team up in a market, and perhaps one day even with the Chinese or with the Californians or with the Canadians to link up. It's a far way off, I know, but our vision should be a global market price to tap on the low-cost solutions for cutting carbon. I think that's the mission I still strongly believe in.
We still hold the faith.
And that is what we are going to develop in our course on climate governance. Because we have some experience now in the EU. We have been cutting down emissions. Today we are 22% below 1990 levels. Under the ETS we did much better. In not more than 13 years, between 2005 and 2018, we were cutting our emissions with 29%. So we have some experience. How limited it is, we have some experience, and in our course on climate governance, we would like to share that experience. What worked, what did not work, what could be an issue to take on later in the field of energy, renewables, energy efficiency, energy governance, and integrated governance, but also in terms of transport, the challenges out there, in terms of climate finance. There is a lot to be said. And perhaps we have to think creatively on the next phases of climate governance in the world, because the EU is becoming a tiny place in the world. You know, in a couple of decades, we are 5% of world population. We are 5% of world emissions. So what about the other 95%? You know, we have to prepare for a world where our part is much more limited. And as we are not yet there, let's influence as much as possible a good debate on these type of issues that are really going to be important today, but also in the future.
I couldn't agree more. And I think we're not having enough of a debate, are we? We're too aligned. Joss. We need to fall out over something.
Yeah, I was a bit disappointed. I have to say.
But on that international point, though, it's so important. I mean, if you look around the world, where are the countries with booming populations? You know, Nigeria is going to be one of those countries in Africa that completely tries to mimic that big industrial growth pattern that we've seen in China be so effective. How can we get in early and help them do that in a green way? And using all of our EU, diplomacy, our aid budgets, our energy expertise, our governance expertise, there's a real role to play in the outside world.
And that is why our course is as much designed for people outside Europe, professionals in the public sector, in the private sector, our professionals in global companies who would like to tap the best of what is available on our experience. And we will do an effort also to attract people from outside Europe, to have them, around the table. We will have a first bit on our online course, sharing what we did in Europe, but there are going to be physically courses here in Florence or in Brussels or elsewhere, where we can come together in small groups and hammer out new formats, new ideas that need to be developed later on. That's
so important. And, the country that could probably benefit the most, and I say this with an Indian family, is India, because the federated system of Europe is not too dissimilar to the federated system of India, and it has all the same challenges. Differences of economic development, not that stronger centre with lots of power in the states and sovereignty issues of that level. I mean, it's not like Europe in that it is a single unified nation, but there are so many practical governance issues.
I cannot agree more. I mean, when we discussed at length the ETS introduction with our Chinese friends, they said, well, you are 28 member states. We have 50 odd provinces, and they are all having very different levels of economic development, industrial development, levels of wealth. So how do you square the circle? And what we did in Europe, de facto, and we are spelling that out in a book that is going to be the basis for our course, is that distribution issues have been dealt with. We are taking on board those confronted with deepest or deeper transformation processes compared to others. Let's face up, we have member states who are highly specialized in coal-fired power generation, and they have to get out of that. But they have to do a lot of investments. And so generating and helping them to generate those investments is something that we learned in Europe. And we can share that with the rest of the world, because that's an essential issue. Distribution, we talked about the gilet jaune, which is the man in the street, but we also have governments and member states with very different levels of economic activity and very different patterns of specialization in one or the other sector.
So the role of distribution seems to emerge at every level.
Well, it's the heart of politics as well. I mean, when you come with a law and you have to have a majority to pass your law, all these distribution issues come squarely on the table. They say, what about my constituents? Are they going to lose? And if they would be losing, how can I have compensation? How can I find part of the solution to overcome, the particular temporary, that short-term problem that my constituents are going to face?
And I think this is an often overlooked part of a carbon market and carbon pricing, in that it gives you a new commodity to be able to help with some of these distributional issues, not just in the revenue side, but in the actual allocation of effort, because we took on, we made sure Western countries were taking on tighter targets and to facilitate this exchange. Anyway, there's tons we could talk about. But what about this commission question? Because that makes me quite...
I think we have to, unfortunately, somehow bring close. I have to say that there are many interesting questions coming on, but I was totally fascinated by the conversation. I didn't want to interrupt the two of you and just say there is a new question. and even because some of your flow of thoughts in a way answer some of the questions. For instance, the one on reorganization of the Commission priorities. I think you clearly gave us a sign of this. I'm afraid we have to close, but it was a real pleasure to have you both here, and I really enjoyed the debate. I would have liked you to disagree a bit more, but I can provoke you more next time.
The reason we didn't fight was because we didn't talk about nuclear, because that's the one thing we don't agree on.
And I think I'm not going to start now. Okay, so thank you everybody for being here, and keep an eye on us to the next online events.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.